What's up? I'm Andrew from the death metal band Ripped to Shreds. Today, I want to talk about how heavy metal upholds white supremacy. I'm not going to go into intersectionality because I'm not really a poli-sci or sociological expert. So what I want to do is talk about my experiences and some of my friends' experiences with heavy metal. So this video is not really aimed at open racists like this or like this, because they'll never care about this stuff anyways. Nor is it aimed at the moderate who believes racial prejudice only manifests in physical violence, or even the white liberal who believes that racism can actually be systemic and institutional. I want to address my fellow Asian Americans and people of color. We often see bullshit like separate the art from the artist repeated, an excuse that'll take too much time to fully unpack in this video, but the motivation behind it is simple. These people don't want to think. They don't want to examine their culpability and participation in a status quo that reinforces white supremacy. So they throw up their hands and they say, "Not my problem. I'm going to pretend harmful things aren't real." There's no rhetoric, no arguments or persuasion that we could use to convince the dominant white culture that our voices are worthy of equal consideration, that our experiences are valid and harmful. To draw a parallel to black civil rights struggles in the 70s and 80s, people of color need to forcefully desegregate heavy metal. We have to forge our own path as leaders and not wait for equality to be granted from on high. Music is inherently political. Music is an inherently political statement. My existence in the United States of America is a political statement. My parents came from Taiwan to the United States in 1978. If they had tried to immigrate 30 years earlier, they would have been denied entry underneath the Chinese Exclusion Act. Just think, how long really is 30 years? For my fellow millennials, that's where our childhood was. That was playing Nintendo 64 with our friends, movie nights at Blockbuster. It was Animaniacs or Captain Planet on Saturday morning cartoons. 30 years is just a blink of an eye. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress in 1882 as a reaction to xenophobia in California, blaming Chinese immigrants for cheap labor that took jobs from honest white Americans. That was followed by the Rock Springs Massacre in 85, where white miners entered Chinatown with rifles and murdered 28 Chinese and burned down 79 homes. And the Hell's Canyon Massacre of 87, where a white gang murdered and robbed up to 34 Chinese miners. It was then extended 10 years by the Geary Act in 1892, and then made permanent in 1902. It also required every Chinese to obtain residence papers that were certified by 2 white witnesses or be deported, resulting in immigration raids and widespread fear. I think that sounds a little bit familiar to what's going on now in 2025. I actually have a fair amount of older family friends who are trying to get passport cards that they can carry on them at all times as proof of citizenship in light of recent ICE activity. It wasn't repealed until the Magnuson Act in 1943, which also allowed Chinese residents to finally become naturalized citizens, but there remained a quota of only 105 Chinese immigrants per year. That wasn't lifted until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Simply put, I wouldn't even be here talking to you guys about death metal if my parents had tried to enter America before 65. Now, I grew up in an ethnic enclave here in California, and I'd like you to remember why those enclaves even exist. In San Francisco, historic Chinatown was the only place that Chinese people were allowed to own property. Near Cupertino, where I grew up, white flight, starting in the late 1980s, created schools that were 90% ethnic Chinese or Indian, with white families claiming that schools were becoming too academically competitive. Statistics show that white flight exists at all income levels of mixed-race neighborhoods. It doesn't matter if the area is poor or rich. So at my high school, we had less than 10 white kids total. And when I started getting into metal music in my teens, the most common question my friends would ask me was, "Why are you listening to that angry white people music?" And it truly is. Heavy metal has a self-serving narrative of global brotherhood, of uniting the world in tape trading and DIY touring and sick riffs. But if you focus on America, you can count bands like Suffocation or Death Angel on one hand, while drowning in a sea of white bands, despite census data showing 20% POC population in the 90s. Are there 2 POC bands for every 8 white bands? Census data today puts America closer to 40% non-white. Are there even 2 POC bands for every 80 white bands? So I think it's obvious heavy metal is majority white in America as well as globally. But in what ways does it uphold white supremacy? And to answer that, we first need to define what supremacy is. It's white people dominating and gatekeeping the social, cultural, and economic capital of America. It's examining everything through the white perspective. It's defending the status quo, the existing racial order of America that elevates the white voice above all the rest. Here's a concrete example that's happened to me uncountable times. Whenever I point out that heavy metal is dominated by white bands, the reflexive response I get is, but what about this band from another country 5,000 miles away? And for 4th or 5th generation Asian Americans, they have close to zero connection with ancestral homelands. And that other country invariably is Japan, and also assumes a pan-Asian identity that doesn't exist. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, Hmong, Laotian, Cambodian, and the many, many different South Asian countries all came to America under extremely different circumstances and different time periods. And they all face different kinds of oppression with wildly varying outcomes of success. Even just talking about ethnic Han Chinese alone, we came to America in 2 major waves. One group from Guangdong as unskilled labor in the 1850s during the gold rush. A second wave from Taiwan in the 1970s as highly educated, skilled professionals, which results in a huge disparity in the education levels and economic success between those 2 groups. And it's that latter wave of Taiwanese immigrants that are weaponized by white America as model minorities to wield their success as a cudgel against other POC, despite being handpicked for immigration due to their skills and education. So this kind of lazy response, what about a band from Japan, both betrays white America's perception of Asians as a monolith that you can't tell apart, and their ignorance of how Asians in their communities are unwelcome. They're looking for scapegoats instead of accepting the uncomfortable truth that they too uphold various systems of oppression. As an aside, can you believe that these 2 guys are still mistaken for me all the time? Despite, I live in California, this guy is in New York, and this guy is in fucking Scotland. And Asians do not feel welcome in heavy metal. You can feel it as soon as you step into any show. If you look at other activities that aren't racially coded as white, like competitive gaming for example, that's dominated by Asian American superstars like Thresh for Quake, or Rambo and Method, and now Stewie 2K for Counter-Strike. And Valorant is so popular among Asian Americans that it's a TikTok stereotype on par with drinking boba. When you look at extreme metal in the Bay, Chio drums in Noothgrush, and there's Kevin from Sutek Hexen. And that's about it for notable musicians. And it's for that reason that I align far more with the hardcore scene rather than death metal in the Bay, because that skews much younger and reflects the actual demographics of the Bay Area. If I go to a death metal show, it's going to be all old white people, and I have like a 50% chance of being asked, where were you really born? But if I go play a hardcore show, all the Filipinos and all the Vietnamese will pull up, all the Chinese and Latinos, all the young TikTok punks show out. It feels like home. When I first started going to local shows here, seeing Cole and Joseph and Brian on stage as Spinebreaker, and then later on as Gulchin Tsunami, made me realize that I could be up there on stage too. And that's a feeling that many other Asians in hardcore here must have shared, because we have all these amazing POC Bay Area bands like Doomsday or Extinguish or Field of Flames, Fentanyl, and more. If we move our gaze to Southern California, their regional metal scene is rich with Latinos, and attending a metal show there is about 50-50 for whites and Latinos. Classic bands like Sadistic Intent, Slayer, Terrorizer, Fear Factory, Excruciating Terror all gave the scene icons like Jesse Pintado or Dino Cazares that they could look up to and set the foundation for things like the Black Twilight Circle and indigenous black metal scene. And that's something I would like to happen for Asians here, for death metal. What about Japan? Let's take a step back to an earlier point. What about this band from Japan? Why do people think of Japan when it comes to Asian metal? And the answer to that is, again, rooted in white supremacy. Japan had two major reformations where other Asian countries did not. They were the first in Asia to industrialize with a Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, bringing in Western reforms and ideas. Japan's domestic record industry started in 1927, which was heavily influenced by importing Western records. Then, America further reshaped Japanese society and culture with their occupation post-World War II. General MacArthur abolished Shinto as the state religion and attempted to Christianize Japan. There were almost 1 million American soldiers on the island over 7 years of occupation, driving entertainment to cater to their tastes. Heian court music, performed on biwas and shakuhachis, that wouldn't do. It had to be jazz or rock and roll. And so Japanese popular culture was remade in the image of America and became palatable to the West. As an aside, this reminds me of when Ghost in the Shell was adapted and ScarJo was cast as the Major. Idiots would claim Japanese people in Japan loved her casting and had no problem with it. And of course, Japanese people living in a 90% ethnically homogenous society, thousands of miles away from America, don't give a shit what happens in Hollywood. But movie executives knew the truth. White American audiences didn't want to see an Asian woman lead a movie, and they weren't going to risk millions on that point. Then we come to essentialist conceptions of Japanese pop culture as superior. And I find this especially egregious because I still personally see supposedly woke leftists and punks espouse this all the time, that Japanese punk and grindcore contain mystical properties that make it cooler. It's in the water. They just do things differently. A nation remade in the image of Western culture to suit white sensibility, and they wonder why they can relate to it better. We can't ignore that Japan has consciously pursued cultural and economic soft power in her post-war years, as the new constitution created by the American occupation force forbade Japan from having a standing army. While Germany was carved up and made to pay reparations, America poured money into reconstruction of Japan as a bulwark against communism in China and Russia. Japan didn't even attempt to address reparations with Korea until 1965, much less the Philippines or China, as part of American anti-communist strategy. And it's from this privileged position that Japan was able to develop their soft power and cultural exports, while other countries in Southeast Asia were focusing on domestic issues and playing economic catch-up. I thought you were from Japan. Koichi Iwabuchi, an influential Japanese sociology professor, theorizes that mukokuseki, or statelessness, was a critical component of Japan's global soft power. Cultural odor that betrayed the Japanese cultural origins of commodities that were to be sent abroad were consciously excised, as seen with icons like Hello Kitty or Mario, literature works from writer Haruki Murakami, and designs of characters from post-2000s anime. Without obvious hints of Japaneseness, these products were thought to be more acceptable to Western tastes. Perhaps it's for this reason that people tell me ad nauseum, I thought you were from Japan. Your band is cool, you look Asian, there are no ethnic instruments, no melodies like... But you can see some Asian writing on the front of the record, so obviously it can't be American in origin. I like it, so there's no way it could be from a geopolitical enemy of America. It must be Japanese. On a related note, another legacy of white supremacy that we see in metal is the use of the Imperial Japanese Army's Rising Sun flag. You can see it painted all over Charvel and Kramer guitars from the 80s. You can see it on the Clash's live album and their merch. To Koreans and Chinese and Filipinos, it's the equivalent of a Nazi swastika. To white people, it's a cool Japanese flag that you can put on any piece of merch. Metal and punk sucks. Moving on to the present day, metal and punk still sucks, even though it's supposed to represent a slice of the population that supposedly cares more about social justice. Here's an example that happened to my friend Yu Ying. Obscene Extreme is the biggest grindcore festival in the world. It's located in Czechia, and it's attended by thousands of radical punks, anarchists, and self-described freaks. Yu Ying was playing with his band LPP and camping out on the festival grounds, and he would be harassed by other attendees who would tell him, hey, don't eat our dogs. The pet taboo is one of the worst in the Western world, and eating people's pets is a racist trope that has persisted in every single country that has experienced Asian immigration. And it's also spread to anti-Haitian propaganda in Springfield in 2024, amplified by Trump and Vance from the bully pulpit. I think a lot of people treat racism as a concept that flows down from the bourgeoisie, that it's merely a tool used by the rich and powerful to divide the working class. And once the working class unites and overthrows the capitalists, racism will be over. But it's the exact opposite. It's a weakness that's only exploited by the bourgeoisie because racism is already extant. Even were there to be a revolution, the resulting communist government would be divided among ethnic lines in favor of the dominant culture, as we can see happened in Soviet Russia, happened in China. Now, here's a quick anecdote. I was at a show talking with a group of musicians backstage, and these are some of the most famous death metal dudes writing the foundational records of the 80s and the early 90s. And we're shooting the shit. And out of nowhere, one of them hits me with a, well, you're Asian, so you must be good at math and science. I'm just surrounded by old white dudes, so I let it go. And then when I was doing the press cycle for the last Ripped to Shreds record, I had an interview with this metal magazine in Germany. And my PR guy told me, hey, this guy's important. They rarely do interviews like this, so put on your game face. I'm like, okay. I call in. It's a pretty normal interview. And then he starts asking me about why I call RTS Chinese death metal. And goes, you Americans always make such a big deal out of race. We don't have anything like that here in Germany. And then he goes into this long spiel about how he's worked with this one Chinese guy for like 20 years. And they don't really understand each other because of their cultures, but they get along. In retrospect, I should have immediately said, well, discrimination in Germany for Turkish immigrants is institutional and systemic, and it creates poverty and extremism among ethnic lines. But in the moment, I was just like, are you fucking serious? In my head, and I let it go. He was blind to his own participation in the system of white supremacy. Willfully so? I don't know. And that's really a common sentiment I've seen with French, Polish, Swedish, Norwegian grinders and metalheads that I've interacted with, that race doesn't matter in Europe. And then they would immediately start saying things about gypsies or Jews or Muslims that would make a KKK member blush. When you point out that what they say is fucked up, you're given we're preserving national culture as an excuse, even though modern nation states didn't even exist 100 years ago and were only formed through conquest in the 1800s. For example, modern Germany was carved out of Prussia and Austro-Hungary, multi-ethnic empires that included Germanic peoples, and we should remember that English is a Germanic language, along with ethnic Ukrainians, Hungarians, Poles, and more. And here's another example of a modern national myth, Italian cuisine. It's often talked about in prescriptive terms and tradition, but foods like tiramisu or spaghetti carbonara or pizza didn't even exist in a modern form before 1950. What tradition? It started yesterday. Then I can't even begin to count all the famous grindcore bands that are supposedly woke, uncritically making jokes about Kung Flu and the China virus. And that kind of widespread rhetoric led to real physical violence against Asians living abroad during the pandemic. And now, most recently of all, we have South Park, which is somehow based among leftist punks for criticizing Trump and ICE, despite having two of the most racially charged Asian caricatures in American media since Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's. Enlightened centrism, where you can make fun of all the sides equally, is horseshit. It's like saying that the rich and the poor are equally barred from sleeping underneath the bridge. To me, it's incredibly frustrating how politically apathetic Chinese Americans are, and how we have none of the solidarity or political consciousness that Black Americans do. Then of course we have the "it's metal, it's supposed to be sketchy and dangerous" rhetoric, which gives us Metal Threat, where legends like Unleashed or Dead Congregation are happy to play with bands like Argosland or Graveland. And those bands aren't sketched merely by association, but openly call for Black enslavement and white Aryan nationalism. And really, one of the most egregious parts of the whole situation is it's been an open secret for months that Graveland and Grand Belial's Key and Argosland were playing Metal Threat. When those bands were announced publicly, some bands finally got cold feet being associated with them, made excuses to drop from the festival. Some of the bands that I know for a fact dropped because Argosland was announced are still too cowardly to admit that that was the reason, and they all made excuses like injuries or visa problems. They were too afraid to admit to their fan bases that they actually did not want to play with a white power band. And that's really how low the bar is, that admitting that you might not want to play with a white power band would lose you fans. Can you even imagine a group of POC booking a show like that? And yeah, I know there's that one Black guy in a band who's stoked to be playing with Argosland at the Fest in Chicago. But, there's also Daryl Davis, who claims that he's de-radicalized KKK members when that same group that supposedly disbanded reformed in 2013, and he would post bail for Imperial wizards whose friends would then claim that he was only using Davis for his money and call him all sorts of racial epithets. And that shit is a feel-good story for white America, to put all the responsibility of racism on black people and POC, to reinforce the self-serving idea that racism is merely prejudicial beliefs between individuals. And of course we have ONSP and other neo-Nazi metal movements in Mexico, or the bizarre case of Blue Eyed Devils, a white power band touring Mexico with one original white member and 3 Mexican session musicians. And those are the remnants of the Spanish colonial system, which placed pure white Europeans at the top above mixed mestizos with the indigenous at the bottom. And Mexican neo-Nazis believe themselves to be pure white European immigrants. It shouldn't be newsworthy. It shouldn't be newsworthy or unique to be an Asian guy saying, hey, racism is actually not cool. But the institutions of heavy metal, from the media to labels, both major and DIY, to the bands and the audience, cater to the interests of the white man. Famous talent scouts like Monty Connor or Mike Gitter were the famous Asian American talent scouts. I can only think of Steve Joe, an uncountable number of notable journalists, whereas Asians really only have Cosmo Lee. I'm reminded a bit of what jazz pianist Toshiko Akiyoshi said on arriving in America. In those days, a Japanese woman playing like Bud Powell was something very new. So all the press, the attention, wasn't because I was authentic. It was because I was strange. And tracing the ascension of Ripped to Shreds, for lack of a better word, back to writing an article for Decibel about Bruheria's racist comments about Chinese people during the pandemic leaves me with very mixed feelings. Because it's unique only in that no one in metal ever considered that racism might be bad before. You can look at Herman Lee, and I followed Dragon Force for a very long time, ever since they blew up in 2006. And it wasn't until maybe the last 2 or 3 years that you would see Herman actually talk about facing racism in the metal scene, despite the fact that I saw so many people making fun of his accent, engaging in the racist trope that all Asians swap their L's and R's, but I guess he didn't feel comfortable to actually address it until now. And I rarely talk about this stuff because you get a lot of people saying that you're lying, you're exaggerating. Worst of all, you get, he never acted like that around me. And I simply don't like dealing with people coming into my DMs saying, oh, I'm not really racist. I didn't mean it like that. I have a black best friend. I love Chinese food. And I'm sure those are things you've all heard a million times before. So over the last 100 and some odd years, Chinese Americans and POC have been systematically excluded from partaking in many cultural institutions. Claiming heavy metal welcomes everyone is meaningless platitudes without conscious effort to rebuild bridges that were burned. And if history has shown us anything, the American institutions that uphold white supremacy are in no hurry to extend their hands. It's up to us to do the work. When Asian Americans come up to me and say, hey, I really like that article you wrote, or I'm really happy to see someone else like myself making this kind of music, that makes me feel like I'm doing something right. Hey, shout out to Meat Ham, your energy is an inspiration. That's all for today. To all my Asian American brothers and sisters and everything in between, support and raise each other up. Next week, I'll do a song breakdown from everyone's favorite Evangelion grindcore band, and then I'll redo my most popular video. But in the meantime, eat ass, blast fast, and peace.